Today, I welcome to the program Ken Block. Ken is the owner of Simpatico Software Systems and author of the book Disproven, My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud for the Trump campaign, the data that shows why he lost and how we can improve our elections. So, Ken, I'm looking forward to learning about this. Let's start at the beginning of this story, and maybe we'll go back further if we need to. Who calls you from the Trump campaign? When? What do they say they want you to do?
Yeah. The day after the campaign, a Trump campaign attorney by the name of Alex Cannon called my cell phone out of the blue and asked me to help the campaign look for voter fraud. It wasn't a job that I had been applying for or pulling strings to try and get. It was pretty much the last thing I thought I would be doing in the month of November 2020. But there he was, and he wanted me to make a straight up assessment, looking for evidence of massive voter fraud, enough fraud to change the election outcome in any of the swing states. And then once we had our agreement in place, unbeknownst to both he and I, when we signed our contract, he started sending me claims of voter fraud that other people had brought to the campaign's attention, asking me to perform due diligence on those claims to see if they would stand up in court.
Now, why you, both in the sense of what were the skills you had that were relevant to finding voter fraud? And number two, was there a political component to it? In other words, were you known to be someone who supported Trump and believed the case that there was fraud, or why you?
Well, so it's a question I can't tell you with certainty what the answer is. I have a national reputation of being an expert in working with voter fraud and voter data more specifically, a decade's worth of experience. And I have found instances of voter fraud in the past, nothing on the scale of what the campaign needed me to find in November of 2020. As I was negotiating my contract with Alex, I wanted to be very upfront with him, and I was. And I told him that in a decade of looking at voter data, I had never encountered anything close to what I knew the campaign would need me to deliver. And I wanted to make sure that both Alex understood and that the campaign generally understood that I was not promising them a positive result, that I would look as hard as could be looked, but that I wasn't going to custom deliver a finding for them, and I would tell them exactly what was actually there versus what wasn't. And that's the way it went. It was a very straight up assessment.
What was the nature of the contract in terms of, did you just say, I'll get to work and you'll pay me by the hour, or it's based on deliver? I know you said it wasn't for delivering a positive result, but what was the sort of nature of how they would pay you? And did you get paid is the other part.
The fine questions. We did the engagement essentially as a project oriented approach. The contract only really foresaw me looking for deceased voters in the swing states and attempting to identify duplicate voters. And what by that I mean someone who voted in one of the swing states and also some other state. And that had a price tag attached to it. I have to use outside vendors with access to very sensitive data. And being paid was a concern because, and most people have heard the rumors that contractors can have a difficult time getting paid from the different Trump enterprises. I expressed that concern to Alex, who immediately said, I totally get it. Don't worry about it. You tell me how much money we have to wire to you. We will wire it to you before you start any work. And that's how those 35 days went. Every new thing that they asked me to do that required expensive analytics, I told them the price, the money immediately showed up in my bank account, and off we went. Alex Cannon did a wonderful thing. He performed his due diligence, which nobody is really aware of, and he created an environment for me and my employees to conduct a straight up assessment of the data without any external political pressure being brought to bear on us, pressuring us to give a finding that wasn't there. It was the best of all worlds in terms of no impediments to doing a good job.
Now, this is very politically touchy in the sense that you and your employees, I don't know if you do vote, but certainly you're allowed to vote. And if you don't vote, that's also a political choice. What was the political implication here? Did your politics play into this in terms of any aspect of this, or your employees? Or because I could imagine someone who has a perspective, and it's obviously there was no fraud that would have been meaningfully relevant to the results, but I'm also getting paid to look for it. It's so hard to imagine that having no impact on the work.
Well, it didn't have any impact on the execution of the work for sure. The way I explained to my family, to my employees, was that I'm being asked to perform an honest set of due diligence, both looking for evidence of fraud and evaluating the claims of fraud by others. And there are very, very few people that I'm aware of that were capable of being able to do that kind of an analysis, one that didn't take politics into account. That's what Alex Cannon wanted. That's the only kind of work I was interested in delivering. So, interestingly, the answer to your question is politics did not play a role in the execution of this work, and I don't believe it probably played a role in the campaign's decision to hire me.
So, as we all know, ultimately, neither you nor anyone else has found detectable, quantifiable, and verifiable voter fraud criteria that you write are important to this. Talk to me a little bit about what did you find? How quickly did it become clear that substantive and election altering fraud did not take place?
Yeah. Um, we found in most of the swing states a handful of deceased votes, fraudulently delivered deceased votes.
And I
We
hate
found,
to interrupt already, but let me ask a question
yeah,
about that. You can submit an absentee ballot and then die, and then comes
yeah, I'm
election
not
day.
talking about
You're
that.
talking about fraudulent deceased votes, and that's an important distinction.
Yes. And if we have time, we can get into what happens to a vote cast early and then the voter dies before the election. It's a fascinating conversation. But in this case, we found actual deceased votes, very small numbers across the swing states, a few hundred duplicate votes, a vote cast in one of the swing states and also in some other state. And that was the extent of the data mining that I was asked to do. But much more importantly, were the claims of fraud that others uh, brought to the attention of the Oval Office and then ultimately the campaign infrastructure. And in that circumstance, we looked at between 15 to 20 different claims of fraud, some of them monumental in scope, every one of which was wrong and could be proven with data to be wrong. And I did that time after time after time after time, to the point where when Alex brought me a new claim, instead of asking me whether the claim was correct or incorrect, he just began saying to me, "Tell me why this one is wrong," because they were all wrong.
Was your instinct that your contact, this Alex Cannon, did he also know there was nothing behind these claims?
I think he was skeptical of the claims. I can't say that with any certainty. We didn't have a first person conversation about that.
Yep.
In fact, we did no chit chatting at all because we had to audit a national election in 35 days. And that's a tall order, no matter how you slice it. So I was on task from the minute the contract was signed until the last swing state certified its election results.
Now, interestingly, you didn't find zero examples. You didn't find enough that they would have made a difference to the results of any state, but you didn't find zero. Now, let's just imagine a hypothetical. Imagine that in some election with an 8 vote margin of victory, you found 30 examples.
Great example.
Then what? What would happen then? What would be the process?
So what most people don't understand, and I'm not sure the Trump campaign understood, nor Rudy Giuliani or any of the lawyers we all know have infamously participated in the claims of voter fraud. When we vote anonymously. Once you stick your ballot in the machine, or however whatever the mechanism is by which you cast your ballot, it becomes anonymous. They can't trace your vote to having voted for a specific candidate. So in your example, where the margin of victory was 8 votes and 30 fraudulent votes were found, you can't show that those 30 fraudulent votes harmed a specific candidate. It's
Mm.
impossible to do. So without being able to show the harm, had I even found 20,000 fraudulent votes in Georgia, I can't imagine a scenario where a judge would look at the proof of those fraudulent votes, but then leap to an incorrect determination that those votes therefore harmed the Trump campaign. That's a leap you can't make, and you cannot possibly infer for whom somebody voted.
Now
And
that
given that,
applies in the
I don't think that he would ever have been successful with the attempt to try to overturn an election by using fraud.
now that applies to the sorts of votes you were looking at. I'm guessing in some, the voting machine, someone hacked it and flipped votes from one candidate to the other, and we have some kind of digital paper trail. That would be something different altogether, right? That's not even in the scope of what you were looking at.
Correct. But I was focused in on voter data and claims that others made that were based on voter data. And as examples of some of these claims, there were funeral homeowners in Pennsylvania who were convinced they had found hundreds of deceased votes. They ultimately didn't understand the data they were looking at. The wildest claim of all came out of Wisconsin, where a group of amateur analysts made a determination that more than 700,000 votes in Wisconsin were fraudulently cast twice. And they made a fundamental mistake in not understanding the data they were looking at. Their claim went to a golfer, that went to the manager of a Trump golf course, that went to Eric Trump, that came to Alex Cannon, and then to me. And that sort of encapsulates the insanity that was going on in November and early December of 2020. There were probably thousands of people heavily vested in trying to prove the claims of voter fraud. And they all came up short. And where the claim wasn't based on data, it was hearsay. It was somebody saw someone do something kind of evidence, which is not allowable in our courts of law. And none of those were successful in any of the lawsuits that were filed, and they won't be in the future either.
If I zoom out a little bit, and I understand that now I'm asking beyond just the sort of alleged fraudulent votes you were looking at, we saw everything from, well, the legal complaints were thrown out, not on merit, but for standing, so courts didn't really rule on anything. Or in Arizona, some ballots had bamboo fibers indicative of some kind of Asian interference. Or in Pennsylvania, when the vans with supposedly sandwiches showed up, they didn't have enough sandwiches for the workers. Therefore, there must have been fill in the blank boxes of ballots. Who the hell knows, right? I'm talking about the full gamut of this stuff. Yeah. Have you ever seen any of these sorts of approaches? I don't care which of these you're talking about. Has this ever actually materially been confirmed to affect the results in any race you've ever looked at? These sorts of claims?
The claims you just suggested, or
any kind of them, the double voting, the dead people voting, or machines, or stuff from Asia, like any of this stuff.
So in North Carolina, a congressional primary was ordered redone by the courts because of an illegal ballot harvesting operation.
Right.
So that is one example where an election was redone. In Virginia a few years ago, one legislative seat ended in a tie, and they had to cast, I think they cast the die to figure out which candidate won that race.
I remember that.
And the winner of that race determined which party controlled the Virginia legislature. So a single fraudulent vote can, depending on the circumstances, have a huge impact in an extremely tight race. In Florida in 2016, I determined in 2018 that about 2,200 duplicate votes were cast in that state and also some other state. And this actually makes perfect sense. People who own multiple homes sometimes do something really bad and take two bites of the electoral apple. And I was able to prove that. Now, 2,200 votes across Florida's 9 million registered voters, or whatever the number is tiny. But remember that in Bush v. Gore in 2000, the margin of victory was 547 votes.
Right.
Now, again, 2,200 fraudulent votes over 547 vote margin, you still can't determine who those votes were cast for. And in 2020, Before the 2020 election happened, I predicted two deceased votes in Pennsylvania before they happened. That prediction was part of a court case that was filed in October of 2020. And sure enough, those two votes ended up being fraudulently cast votes on behalf of a deceased person. After the votes were counted, after the election, the registered voter was removed. The person who voted, two different people voted each of those fraudulent votes. They were charged, prosecuted, and convicted.
Now, what do you mean you predicted it?
Yeah, I found that the registered voter was deceased, and that deceased voter was registered in September of 2020, just ahead of the mail ballot window, and they'd been
And they
dead
were
for
already dead at that point.
by many years. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, that may be the first example of predictive voter fraud analysis. But what's really interesting about it, and it happens, right? I mean, it doesn't happen very often, for which we should all be thankful, but there are states, Pennsylvania in particular, does a terrible job at removing deceased voters, which is what made this fraud possible. And in both circumstances, the person who committed those fraudulent votes was a registered Republican who admitted that they committed that fraud and that the fraudulent vote was cast on behalf of President Trump. So the whole narrative that voter fraud is something perpetrated by Democrats almost exclusively isn't true. And in the 8,000 plus duplicate votes I found in 2016, it was about 50-50 Republicans versus Democrats in terms of who cast those votes.
Now, the interesting thing about that is if there's 1,000 vote margin and you find 30,000 fraudulent votes, but about 15,000 were Democrat to Republican or to the benefit of one party, the other 15,000 to the benefit of the other party, your result is still pretty good, which is there's a margin of 1,000, right? I mean, that's the interesting thing about if it's being done equally, it doesn't really change the outcome.
I mean, it does. Well, it doesn't. But more importantly, it can't change the outcome because you can't infer that just because the registered voter was a Democrat, that the vote cast was Democrat.
True.
And by the way, Trump didn't have standing in some of the court cases because he couldn't document the harm that the campaign received as a result of the fraud claims that were part of the lawsuit. Right. So it's complicated. And in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've been around enough to know, I think that trying to overturn an election legally with a foundation of fraudulent votes probably won't ever prove to be successful.
Last thing I want to ask you, in a country with 331, probably 340 million people at this point, and I don't know the total number of people who could vote, but we're talking about over 150 million who do in most presidential elections. Is 0 examples of this stuff the goal we need to get to? Or is it acceptable in a modern Western society to say, listen, the number isn't 0, but it's so small that it's not really something we need to worry about because it doesn't affect the outcomes?
Many Democratic states have joined a consortium of states called ERIC, E-R-I-C, all uppercase, whose mission is to try to address some of these data issues, duplicate registered voters, deceased voters, and that sort of thing. So now, and it's mostly Democrats. We can't get into the politics of it right now. But the answer to you is yes, it's important. And most Democratic secretaries of state understand the importance. That's why they joined this consortium in the first place. When you have states that properly maintain their data, standing alongside states that do a terrible job of maintaining their data. New Jersey has 25,000 registered voters born in the year 1800 per their voter registration database. That's not voter fraud. It's sloppy data. 8,000 of those voters cast votes in 2020. That's not voter fraud, but that's really bad data practices, right? So it's really important. And because our elections are so important, having quality data behind our elections is important. And yeah, we should strive for 0 as much as we can, because when an election is decided by one vote, we shouldn't have to have the agita of, oh my God, there were 1,000 fraudulent votes in the framework of that one vote. Now what do we do?
Right.
We can avoid the fraudulent votes. It's not rocket science.
We've been speaking with Ken Block. The book is Disproven: My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud for the Trump Campaign. the data that shows why he lost, and how we can improve our elections. Ken, I really appreciate you being here today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.